Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm going to try and be super animated because I know that many of you are jet lagged, right? And it's a little bit hard at 4 in the afternoon. So this is the subject for the remarks this afternoon, educating for integrity, leading our profession as an existential imperative, as something that we must do, something that everything else depends on. How do we do that now in this current context? So I've divided it up into the familiar trinity. The structure of the presentation is as follows. First, how can we understand the relationship between achievement and integrity? In many contexts, we've got very, very good at pushing achievement scores up. We know how to do that, but sometimes it might feel like the integrity is being left behind. So I want to spend a few minutes on that relationship. And then I want to think that out of that discussion, we can deduce some guidelines for action, some things that we must do. If we didn't need to do them before Brexit or before Trump, we really need to do them now. We need to think very seriously about the kind of future that we want to bequeath to the rising generations. And then finally, if we can we find some promise in this present moment? So we've been through a data-driven age. We've been through an achievement-obsessed age. Now we're starting to transition into a new time where there's increasing concerns around well-being and identity. But maybe there's something even beyond that. Maybe there's a new phase of meaning and purpose. And that might be the promise of the present moment, that we take ourselves more seriously, that we're more engaged with our students than ever, and that we really reach out to the parents and the communities while mindfully attending to our core values. And maybe I would just say, if you look up the word mindful online, it's very interesting. And the way that I use the term is in some of the definitions that come to us from Sanskrit. It actually has a lot to do with remembering. It has to do with remembering your core values. What is it that you care the most deeply about? And how will we nurture those values? Because there's a lot that goes on in our world that will distract us from our core values. And just a little bit of an autobiographical story there. I was at one point in my life where I was managing big federal grants in the US, and then it all kind of came to a close. I did something I probably shouldn't have done, which I signed a petition along with other educators protesting the war on Iraq. And I said, we really need that money for our schools and for our communities. And in the time of George W. Bush, if you signed that kind of a petition protesting, your chances for federal funding were not really great. So I thought a lot about what I was doing, and I thought about the work that was going on in the schools, and I tried to get back to my core values. And that, I think, is really the call of whether you call it mindfulness, whether you call it discernment, whether you call it being a caring educator. That is something that I think is a challenge which stays with us throughout our lives, no matter where we are, no matter what we're teaching, because there are so many alluring distractions. So how can we capitalize on that present moment? Now, I'm going to speak fairly briskly here, trusting that the translators are able to keep up with me. Are you guys okay back in the translation booth? Yep, okay, very good. That's great. So how do we understand this relationship between achievement and integrity? Well, one of the ways that we can do this is by starting with what integrity is not. So in the US and other systems where we've been putting enormous pressures on educators to get their test score results up, we've had an epidemic of schools and school systems in which not the children, but the teachers and the administrators were caught cheating and manipulating student test scores. Why is that? Why is that a new phenomenon? Is it the individual educators in that system, or is it something that the system is doing to them? This is not just a US-based phenomenon. China has also had this problem with cheating on its student rankings systems, and we've also seen examples of this in British schools and universities in recent years. So why is this? What's happening? Now, for many years, in many sectors in the business community, there was a lot of research about how important goals are for your organization. And the idea was that you should have what were called BHAG goals, big, hairy, and audacious goals. And you should set these enormous goals, and then you should put people under incredible pressure to get those results for those goals. But there's a report that I recommend to all of you. It's called Goals Gone Wild. Not Girls Gone Wild. Don't go to that website. I did not say that to you. I said Goals Gone Wild. Translators, don't let me down, okay? The systematic side effects of over-prescribing goal setting. Really encourage you to read this article if you're in a system where there's a lot of pressure on your educators, because what it basically says is when you set these BHAG goals for your system, people feel under so much pressure that they start gaming the system. And it's not epiphenomenal. It's not something that just happens every now and then. It's systemic. And then we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing? We are in a moment of organizational alienation from the purposes of schooling when we start putting so much pressure on people. So I read that piece, and that led me into deeper reflections on, well, what is the nature of achievement? What do we really hope for our young people? What do we imagine? What is the nature of the challenges that face us on our fragile planet today? And how can we make sure that we're raising a rising generation that is looking forward with confidence and zest to resolving these problems? How can we do those things? Well, we can't do them if we just focus on achievement as student test score results, because there's so many kinds of knowledge and so many kinds of skills that we need that go beyond how well students do on their test score results. Francesca, are you here? I have a colleague from Rome. I was teaching in Venice in the fall, and Italy has a long tradition of oral examinations of students, forma la interrogazione. And I asked my students, how old is this tradition? And they said, about 2,000 years. I said, really? Where did it come from? Cicero? So in Italy, they have a tradition that goes back for over 2,000 years on oral examination. Why did it matter so much? Because if you wanted to live in a republic, Cicero said, then you have to know how to debate. You have to know how to marshal ideas. You have to know how to present them with persuasive force. So there's lots of ways to think about achievement, including oral presentations, excellence in sports, the arts, hiking in nature, whatever you may seek to pursue, there's lots of ways in which human beings can excel. Now so that's the second form of achievement, the pursuit of a worthy goal. And one of the schools that's I've had the pleasure of studying in Singapore is Assumption Pathways School, where they work with all young people who have struggled in their own academic careers to come up with their own goals. So if you're petrified of singing, you try out for the school musical. If you're afraid of heights, you start rock climbing classes. You can establish your own goals, and these can be good goals to help peers who are struggling with substance abuse problems and so forth. So that's another definition of achievement. And then a third one, and the one that I think we need to be most concerned with in education today, is achievement as a result of a school system. What do our school systems do in terms of the definitions of achievement? How do we define achievement for our young people? What do we say is a worthwhile achievement and what is not a worthwhile form of achievement? The teachers that I worked with in Boston on the Mindful Teacher Project experienced so much alienation in their system. And there was one teacher who was working on a project on the civil rights movement, and her principal said to her, well, that's okay, as long as your test score results go up, right? That's alienated teaching. So how can we come up with achievement in a way that we can construct more mindfully, with greater discernment? So these are questions I think we need to ask ourselves, and then we need to ask ourselves, what is integrity? Okay? What is integrity? Is integrity a personal characteristic? So we often say integrity is a person who exemplifies what they say and what they do are integrated. Can we think of integrity as a professional disposition? So there's some research on teaching which is a bit discouraging in that teachers will see other teachers treating students badly but won't say anything. Because what kind of professional culture do we have where we hold each other accountable for treating students well? And then finally, integrity as a result of a school system. Does the whole school system help the educators to do their personal best, to flourish, help those educators to take care of themselves so they don't come to school burned out and angry and take it out on the kids? What does the school system do to encourage the educators to reflect on their core moral values and then to seek to enact them. Can we put these things together then? Can we put together achievement in a broad humanistic sense in school systems and integrity so that we don't have alienated learning, alienated teaching, we have mindful and integrated teaching and learning? Can we do those things? Well, we can't do them if we put together systems that continuously produce low achievement and low integrity. And that's what we've done for many years in my own country. I do love my country. I love the United States. It's got so many great things that's going for it. But in our school system, we put tremendous pressure on educators in our schools that are struggling the most. And we give them very, very high standards. And if they don't get the results up, then we close the school, we fire the principal, we make the teachers reapply for the jobs, and this has not worked. If you just look at our PISA scores, whatever you think of PISA scores, they have not improved in the different administrations of the test. Now, you can sometimes get high achievement and low integrity, and here's how you do it. We know this pretty well. You get bright young students out of the top liberal arts colleges. You give them 6-week summer institutes. You throw them into the classroom. You have them work 80-hour work weeks. They're totally exhausted. They're not married. They do it for 3 to 5 years, and then they leave because they want to get a life back. And you can do that. You can do that for a few years, right? It's a very cynical approach to school reform. It's totally deprofessionalized. It perfects unsustainable educational change. It perfects it. So if you want to have that as your goal, then pursue that model. Or you can have the model of low achievement and high integrity, so you get an educator in who's a minister from a local church, also a certified teacher, and you say, look, we don't know what else to do with our struggling school here. You seem to have 400 folks from your neighborhood who are going to your church. Come on in and lead our school. And then you bring in the principal. I studied this school. And the principal, his solution to everything is love. Love the children, love the teachers, love the parents. I called him Dr. Love. He had indiscriminate love for everybody and everything all the time. The one thing he didn't have was any strategy for improving learning. And when I talked to the teachers in the school, I said, how do you guys learn from each other? They say, actually, we don't do that. It's the principal who comes in and assesses us. And he's in our classrooms all the time. So you're not developing any collective capacity with that model. Now, you can also get high achievement and high integrity. How do you do that? So one of my former students, Andy Bott, became the principal of Orchard Gardens Elementary School, well, actually kindergarten through 8th grade school in Boston, and he came into a school that was known as a principal killer. It had had 6 principals in 6 years, right? Kids were always out of control. There was violence in the school. It served a large inner city population. And Andy Bach comes in and he looks at the situation. He says, we got to do something to shift this whole culture. So what he does is he looks at the salaries of all the security guards in the school and he fires them. Every single one, they're fired. Then he does a national search for the best art and music teachers he can find in the whole United States. And he brings those art and music teachers into the school, and when a student misbehaves, they're given a saxophone or a paintbrush, and they're told, express with this instrument or with this paintbrush what you're feeling inside. And then artwork is put up all over the school, and if a student is caught doing anything well, you give them a shout out over the school intercom system. And what do you know? The achievement results made that school one of the most rapidly improving schools in Massachusetts. But it doesn't just have to be a US example. At the Robert Bosch Gesamtschule, or comprehensive school in Hildesheim, Germany, they were struggling. Low student enrollments, low staff morale. They decided to come up with their own protocol for visiting each other's classrooms and giving each other feedback. And they turned into one of the most improving schools in Nordrhein-Westfalen in Germany. So there's lots of different ways that we can get to high achievement and do it with integrity. But we'll have to think strategically about how we do that. It won't be easy, it'll be hard. There'll be lots of problems on our path to optimizing achievement with integrity, because we've got lots of roadblocks that we've put in the way of our educators. And the first one is our ideologies. So I was just at a session with some Latin American colleagues, and they are experiencing the brunt of the neoliberal onslaught of new public management in their continent, right? Here come the markets. Here comes the managerial language. Here comes the disruptions of the professional associations. Here comes one model of parent engagement, which is choice. It's not participation. It's not democratic. It's choice. You get to choose the school. right? And then if you've got enough funding, then you can, ratchet it up just one little bit so that you can get into a school that's not a traditional public school, it's also not an elite private school. So our ideologies have made it very, very hard for us to do the best that we can do. And then this has been driven by certain imperial imperatives, ideas coming mostly from the United States and from England that are pushed out onto the world with a variety of political manipulation that guides that through the World Bank and other transnational aid organizations. That's made these ideas susceptible to policymakers integrating them into their context. Even if you're in wonderful social democratic Norway, it's coming in. Certainly if you're in Latin America, if you're in Southeast Asia, those things have gotten in the way of our change. And we've looked at our educators as people who need to be given orders, and we've micromanaged them through prescriptive interventions. Meanwhile, in countries like the United States, we have high-achieving, high-equitable Canada on our northern border. What have we learned from Canadian reforms? Zero. So there's a bizarre insularity that happens, and boy, has this ever increased in the last months. Everybody's jumping back into their foxholes now. We're going back to our nationalist fortresses. Not helpful for a globalizing world where there's more movement of people and ideas and technologies than ever before. And finally, the old imperative that has had such an impact on students and their learning has been the instrumental imperative. We invest in our kids so that they'll be good knowledge workers of the future. The broader human purposes of education, being a good citizen, being a good neighbor, caring about your planet, these have all been pushed into the background. Are you all with me on these points? You understand? Okay, I know I'm speaking to the converted here. I said after Andy spoke, I turned to a colleague and I said, this is like going to church. And it doesn't really matter how many times you've heard it, because I've heard Andy speak about professional capital many times. You still end up feeling great, right? And you have to hear these messages again because there's so much in the culture that says that these ideas are problematic. Anyway, how can we get past these old imperatives? Well, we got to get better at looking at evidence, all kinds of evidence, not just student achievement data. How long are people living in our society? What's the nature of their access to health care? We need to look broadly at how well people are doing. And then, whatever is being pushed out from the imperial center, we better get good at interpreting it in our own context, because it's incomplete information if we don't bring our moral values to bear. Beyond prescription, there is the promise of a humanistic professionalism, one where we care for our students, we know how to look after ourselves, we look after our planet. And then beyond the insular imperative, there is a global imperative. How do we care about humanity as a whole? And if there's anything that keeps me coming back to working with Education International time after time after time, is we have to overcome the curse of xenophobia and nationalism and understand what the cellist Pablo Casals said so beautifully. Love of the country is a beautiful thing, but why does the love have to stop at the border? Beautiful quote. And then finally, beyond the instrumental imperative, if we can help our young people to find purpose and meaning in their lives, and you can't just tell somebody what their purpose and meaning should be. You have to help them to find that. So can we build that part of the human condition back into our education? Now, if my hypothesis is right with this, the old imperatives have led us to one goal, testing for fidelity. You're just testing that system, and you kind of treat the whole thing as a fine-oiled machine. If we're able to pursue these new imperatives, we'll be getting to something much finer. We'll be getting high results on student learning, broadly constructed, and we'll be doing it with complete integrity, so that when you go to your heavenly reward, we won't talk about the other place, when you go to your heavenly reward, you'll be able to say, I did my very best by my kids. I struggled, I faltered, I had problems from time to time, but I'll tell you what, I was always bringing my core moral purposes into the profession. Can we do these things? Well, let me just quickly go through each one of these. So this ideological imperative started off in Chile and Latin America under the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. It was an American imperial import. okay? Neoliberal models applied to education. They gave Chile the most unequal education system in Latin America in the world today. This was all programmatized by Margaret Thatcher in the UK under the National Reform Act of Education, spread like wildfire to the United States, where charter schools began taking over, transforming the educational landscape. In some Australian states, like Western Australia, these ideas have been applied, and even social democratic Sweden, which you would think might have known better, found itself caught up with the excitement of market ideology being applied to education. Now Liberia has turned over its whole public education system to a private provider, and the same ideas have been spreading broadly to India and to China, and even Singapore, though it has a strong public education system. 80% of the kids in Singapore go to shadow schools in the afternoon. So they also have a thriving private education sector. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with private education sector, but the question is, what is the role of the private sector in lifting performance for the system as a whole? In general, the data tells us there is no role. And the OECD has been very clear on this. If you want to lift your performance as a whole, don't use markets. And the pressure on accountability in the system has led educators to burnout, demoralization, opting out of the profession. I have so many wonderful educators in my life who have left the profession because of these pressures, and there's been an excessive onus placed on testing and testing results under these old imperatives. So we got to move beyond this. How are we going to do this? In my book, The New Imperatives, I describe a lot how Germany looked at the reforms that were coming out of the United States and England, but tried to do some things differently. So you have Teach for America in the US, which basically replaces classroom teachers with unprepared teachers. But Teach for Germany, you prepare teachers' aides. Okay? You make sure that your teachers are very highly paid. You make sure that they have the equivalent of 2 master's degrees. Okay? You introduce some testing, grades 3 and 6, but it's optional whether you want to do German or math or both. And it's no stakes testing. It's testing for diagnostic purposes, not to punish educators, not to stigmatize the children. So, and then Japan also has a strong public education system. Norway, which I just mentioned. And then I'm looking at my little map here. Sorry, I'm having a little hard time seeing. Singapore, of course, has a very strong system of public education. New South Wales in Australia. Kenya and Uganda have been fighting back against Bridge International. I spoke with a couple of colleagues over lunch today who are doing heroic work in that regard. And Canada has also done a fine job of holding off this, this push towards privatization and markets. So public investment, education for the whole purpose, whole person, and the common good. Can we create educational systems that do these things? And the pressure is on us right now. We're at a tipping point. Okay, we just had a meeting about whether we could build some kind of pedagogical movement throughout Latin America that could resist these trends. Very important, very important. If we don't address these things now, the history of education will look very, very different decades from now. So we have to decide, are we really going to try and uphold these ideas of public education for the common good? Can we pass this on to the next generation? Or will education look very, very different? Will we continue to just accept it being pushed out from the imperial center? And it's not just countries in Latin America or Africa or Asia that have been susceptible to these trends. It's also been countries like Australia, or as I mentioned previously, Sweden. So a strong push from imperial centers, but these can be resisted, and they get resisted by educators everywhere. So there's a wonderful group of intrepid educators in Mexico that work with learning communities under a brilliant educator named Gabriel Camara, who wrote this beautiful book, Enseñar y Aprender con Interés, okay? Teaching and learning with interest, allowing students to choose their own freely selected topics, and then tutoring one another and get very, very good at the art of tutoring one another. And if you go into one of these schools and you see all these kids tutoring each other, and then at the end of the day you go into another school and you see teachers tutoring each other, you have a sense of, wow, there's so much power latent in this profession if we can just capitalize on it. And then Yelmer Evers, who is here, has written a glorious book called Flipping the System. Not flipping the system so that technology comes first and the human being comes second. That's happening in many places right now. Flipping the system so the human beings come first and the system serves the human beings instead of the other way around. And then my little book, The Mindful Teacher, which was such a beautiful thing. I got together with beat up Boston public school teachers Basically, I had friends in the system who were magnificent award-winning teachers, and they were getting ready to quit. We said, we have to do something to stop this. What can we do? And they said, can we just have Saturday seminars? And then the teachers really came up with the term mindfulness because they knew that they were alienated. They knew that they were estranged from their profession, and they begged for meditation on Saturdays. They said it's the only time that we ever get a chance to stop, to quiet our minds, to relax our bodies, and to focus. So if you're interested in that kind of approach to education, I recommend the Mindful Teacher to you. Now, in a lot of systems everywhere, teachers are under more prescription and under more surveillance than ever before. So in Boston, we call it clipboarding. It's not a nice word. It means a stranger shows up in your classroom with a clipboard, takes detailed notes on what you do, and then disappears. You never get any feedback. You don't do what we do in higher education. If I'm observing a colleague, I sit down first, we talk about the lesson plan, then I observe, then we debrief afterwards. Okay? That doesn't happen. No. There's just a random person shows up in your classroom and observes you for evaluative purposes. This is not going to be how we're going to improve teaching and learning. There have to be other approaches that endeavor to do this. And we're not going to improve teaching and learning just by giving teachers iPads and then putting a webcam in the corner of the classroom so we can see what they're doing, and having a bunch of consultants in Cambridge, Massachusetts, writing their lesson plans for their iPads and having them read that to the kids. And this quote here, by the way, is from an independent report on the Bridge International Academy schools, which was positive. They loved the Bridge International Academy of Schools. And please pay attention to that last sentence there. It's essential. Through standardization and automation, Bridge has streamlined their operations and has largely removed teachers and administrators from the education process altogether. You have removed human judgment entirely from the interaction with the students. Now, you might say, oh, gee, okay, I'm coming here from Switzerland, or I'm Dutch, or I'm Canadian. I don't really have to worry about these things. This is an Apple IIe. Apple IIe was designed for children. When I started writing my doctoral dissertation back in the 1980s, I started on an IBM, and I switched to an Apple IIe. Now I do everything on Apple. It was a massively disruptive technology. And Bridge International Academies could be coming to your country, could be coming to your school, okay? And this is what happens. Clayton Christensen and colleagues have described this, how these disruptive technologies can come in and they disrupt everything. And technology is doing this now, friends. When I got ready to go to my hotel in San Antonio, I'm a member of the Hilton hotel chain, and I got an email that said, great, you're never going to have to check into a hotel again. Just all you have to do is get it on your card here with this app, right? Then when I got to the hotel in San Antonio, I was punching in. You now punch in the elevator floor that you're going to go to. You get in the elevator, okay? There's no keys. Right? Everything is subject to massive disruption. I was talking to a colleague today who's saying, okay, well, we've got these first droids they're going to be starting in Dubai. People are going to start flying across the sky. If you ever liked to look at the sky because it was so peaceful and quiet, enjoy the next few months. There's massive disruption happening everywhere, including in our public schools. So how do we get beyond this? We're going to have to be much smarter. We're going to have to be much more strategic. We're going to have to be so much better organized. And here are two books coming from very different perspectives, Professional Capital and the Tullis Studies, that basically, in my reading, agree on the same things. We've got to get really smart. We've got to develop our human capital. We have to develop our social capital, our ability to relate to one another and listen to one another. And then we have to have this decisional capital, this ability to make good judgments. Teaching is complex. Kids are interesting people. They're challenging, right? You got 35, or one colleague said 100 of them in front of you. It's a demanding craft for the very best of us. So if these are the ingredients that have been identified by Andy and Michael Fullen in Professional Capital, let's see what Tullis says. Pretty much the same thing. Professionals need to have a lot of knowledge. They have to know how to work together with their peers. And they also have to know how to make good judgments. So I think that the research is increasingly showing us the way forward as educators. Will we be wise enough to listen to it, to study the research, to act upon it? And can we do this in a methodical way, in a caring way, and pretty damn quickly? pretty damn quickly because the other folks are organizing at the speed of lightning. Can we do these things? That's really a historical question that I'm not so sure of. On a good day, I think, yes, we can mobilize these forces. That's why I love to come back to the EI office. I'm feeling with like-minded folks. That's why I love to come and work with you all. But on a bad day, it feels like there's just so much momentum. And as you know, we now have a Secretary of Education in the United States does not have a single idea about how to improve education, rather, other than markets. No idea at all. Andy talked about the policy vacuum. Okay, one solution, markets. Okay, and we've lost billions of dollars from our education budget. The only area where funding was increased was for markets. This stuff is for real, folks. They're not playing any games, right? And we're talking about our children and their futures. Now, in Germany, they have this expression, der Mauer im Kopf, the wall in your head. It used to be used to refer to the Berlin Wall, or the wall that separated East and West Germany. And in our minds and in our souls and in our hearts, look at how many countries now are building those walls in their heads. Not just against the 56 million refugees who are out there, the biggest surge since the Second World War, as Andy said, but also in the US, building a wall against Mexico. What's that about? And recently we had a meeting of the American Educational Research Association in San Antonio, Texas. And you know what? You walk around, it's spooky. There's fewer international delegates. This is an insular attitude, the idea that you just withdraw to your own nation. We're not going to be able to do that. We're going to have to do what the Dolores Commission report told us to do. And how can we build real education for the 21st century? So we've got to get good at knowing things, we've got to get good at making things, and we have to learn how to be. How can we be in this world? How can we be without being endlessly acquisitive? How can we be without commoditizing everything? Okay, and that's what I really heard in your critique of what's happening in that one system, Andy, is that mindfulness is getting commoditized. You can commoditize anything. Okay? But still, of course, the question is, how should we be in the world? And then how can we be together? And when the Dolores Commission wrote this report, they said that was the skill we were going to most need for the future, how we can be together. Well, we can draw on international accords like the Declaration and the Convention of the Rights of the Child. They not just say that children have the right to a high-quality education, they also have some things like children have the right to play. The right to play. How many of our schools have actually enshrined that as a right for children? How many of our children know that they have a human right to play? What would we have to do to transform our systems? This is a moral imperative that we need to address. So we have to work with Education International. We have to come to these meetings. We have to traverse our different cultural understandings of what education should be, because we have a global imperative like never before. Never before. This vulnerability that we have right now. And if we can do this, can we do this with meaning? Okay, not just instrumentally, not just where we reduce schools to what Gert Biesta calls learnification, where it's just mechanics, right? And the kids are just memorizing formulas and memorizing vocabulary. No, it has to be education with meaning. So if you want to learn a word in your own language or another language, you have to use it purposefully 10 times. It's not enough just to memorize it. You have to use it in an original context 10 times. That's what the research tells us. Okay? So we can't just pound away at the kids to memorize. Education has to be purposeful. And meanwhile, our kids are begging us. They're pleading with us not to give up on them. This is from a Canadian educator in a project that I have been working on. Don't give up on us. Even though we aren't always easy and we know your jobs are really hard, please don't give up on us. That's not a plea for just more factual information. That's a plea for a human connection. Can we give this to our young people? So, I love this book. It's Primo Levi, Se questo è un uomo, If This Be a Man. It's his recollections of his time spent in the Auschwitz concentration camp. And one day, Primo Levi was told to go get lunch for the other inmates. And a young Alsatian inmate asked him to teach him some Italian. Now, at that point in Levi's internment, he hadn't been speaking Italian to anyone because most of the Italian inmates had died. So he was left with German and he was left with Polish. And he tried to remember something that his teachers had taught him in school. His teachers taught him some lines from Dante's Inferno. And they go like this: Considerate la vostra semanza. Fatti non foste a vivere come brute, ma per seguir virtute e conscienza, which means consider from what noble seed you spring. You are created not to live like beasts, but for the pursuit of virtue and knowledge. And when Primo Levi is able to remember those lines, he says, it was like a trumpet blast. It was like the voice of God. For a moment, I forgot where I was and what had been done to me. Educators, dear friends, let's not forget to give our children poetry. Let's not forget to give our children music. Let's not forget to introduce them to the biggest ideas that human beings know how to imagine about a better future. And you might think, well, okay, that's kind of an interesting historical artifact. That's okay. Does this have any meaning for people today? So I was walking around in the island of San Michele outside of Venice, and I came across this tombstone. The gentleman had put a picture of himself on there. Fate non foste a vivere come brute, ma per seguir virtute e conoscenza. You were not made to live like beasts, but for the pursuit of virtue and knowledge. Why does somebody put something like that on their tombstone? Okay, it's about a call to dignity. It's about a call to remind us that we are not born to be the slaves of anyone or any particular system. Can we teach such poetry to our students today? Can we do that? And they will face adversity in their lives. Hopefully it won't be adversity like Primo Levi faced, but other forms of adversity. So this is a picture of my wife and me. It was caught by the Boston Globe after President Trump did the executive ban on folks coming into the United States from Muslim countries. I was proud to go at this demonstration. The signs were made by my daughter. My grandmother was an immigrant. She came to the United States as an orphan. Her mother had died in Ireland. Her father moved to Canada. He shortly died of pneumonia. And there was a minister from Buffalo, New York, who saw the situation of this orphan basically being raised by some slightly older brothers and sisters. Now, in those days, there was no border between the United States and Canada, so she just came down and moved. But my mother used to tell me with tears in her eyes the wonderful lines from Emma Lazarus's New Colossus about the Statue of Liberty. Gee, I get choked up now thinking about it. I'm so glad my mother passed away, you know, so that she doesn't have to live in this age now where we turn aside refugees, where we treat outsiders like they're some kind of monsters. We have to reverse these trends, friends. We have to do this. And it's especially acute in the United States, but it's in many countries. So how can we do that? We're going to have to get good at studying evidence, and we're going to have to get good at interpreting it, not according to just old metrics, but to our deepest imaginings about what a future could mean. We're going to have to get better at supporting our profession, our beleaguered profession, which is under threat from so many corners today. We have to remember, you can have some good criticisms of the public school system for sure, but let's not be so merciless that we rip apart the foundation of our very lives and our very cultures. And we have to understand we live in one planet in which we're all deeply interconnected with one another. I'm not sure where my suit came from. I don't know who prepared the food that I ate today. I'm not sure who made the glasses that I'm wearing, but I do know that I am caught up in this inextricable network of mutuality, Martin Luther King called it. And I cannot extricate myself from that without denying my own very humanity. And can we help our young people to discover that life is much more than making money? It's about finding beauty. It's about finding purpose. It's about developing friendships. It's about being in love. And it's about suffering also from time to time. That's part of what it is to be a human being. Can we do those different things? I think we can. I think we can rediscover the grandeur of education. That's from a blog that I did. And I think we can do all these things collectively. We can rediscover its grandeur. We can nourish our collective sense of responsibility for a rising generation. We can promote teaching that just sparkles with creativity to help all of our young people to thrive. And we can traverse the terrain of school improvement by learning from others. And we have to do that in ways that just hones and polishes that professionalism and just makes it so scintillating that anyone would want to send their kids to our school, because we've been learning by studying, by being in conversation with our colleagues, and by learning from the best practices of our colleagues from all over the world. I don't know if we can do all of these things. I hope we can do them in a mindful, caring, and thoughtful way. I hope that you hear my appeal to all of us to do our very best so that we leave a legacy in the footprints of the sand and time that is positive. And there's one thing you cannot do. You cannot not leave a legacy. You're touching other lives. So please, let's make sure that we leave the very finest legacy that we can. Thank you so much for your time.